It looks like John's going to make you wait and come to the stand to hear his David Beckham impression. Fortunately, every word he said sounds like him. My name is Rajiv. I'm from a company called FixFlo. I'm going to find somewhere to put this down. And today I'm going to be talking to you about fundamental changes to Section 21, which could pretty accurately be summarised as why Section 21 proceedings have become harder. Before I start, I'll give you some of my background. Before starting FixFlo, I was a property lawyer. I worked in London and New Zealand. I've been working on these changes with various groups, including ALA. And today, it's all about understanding the changes so your business not only complies, but so that you can use the changes as a way to increase your revenue. Now, being an ex-lawyer, some habits die hard. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. Ordinarily, a disclaimer is hidden away on the final slide of a presentation or in the speaking notes somewhere. I brought it up front and centre to highlight this is a horribly complex set of changes. The government has issued guidance, but really the guidance hasn't particularly helped. On the day that the guidance came out, I spoke with a lawyer called Tessa Shepperson, who some of you may know. We came up with 4 simple scenarios, but 6 answers. It took 2 qualified lawyers 2 hours to come to different conclusions that we agreed could both be right. So what this means is that there will be a lot of test cases. And a test case in this scenario means a tenant facing a Section 21 proceeding and alleging that you've not followed the new process correctly. It's not like the display of letting agency fees, where you've got trading standards coming to your office. This is a tenant in a property who doesn't want to move out. In a lot of areas of the UK, there are increasing rents on a monthly basis. So they want to stay in, and they're going to be using this to their advantage. So today, I'm going to tell you about what's changed to Section 21. Given that the changes came in on the 1st of October, hopefully you'll be aware of them, so I'm going to go over those at a relatively high level. I'm going to focus in on retaliatory evictions, which are the most complicated and probably the most controversial set of changes. I'm going to give you some tips to prepare your business, not just to get ready for the changes, if you haven't already, but how you can use them as a marketing advantage to grow your bottom line. And at the end, there'll be time for questions. I'll also be on my stand, although if you've got questions for John, he'll answer in a far better voice. So, as well as being a former lawyer, I'm a landlord. And the way I look at it is, Section 21 gives me certainty that I can get my property back. It gives me certainty about my investment. The right form of notice with the right notice period, and I know the outcome. And that's the way it's always been. Well, Section 21 has changed. And why would you do that? Well, first of all, the private rented sector has become increasingly important. There are over 4 million households in the private rented sector. And according to PwC, so a global accountancy and consultancy firm, by 2025, more people will live in the private rented sector than in a home that they own with a mortgage. Now, for those of you agents who are sales only, it's something for you to bear in mind. The demographic of the UK is changing. Now, as well as having more and more tenants, they've become increasingly important, both in the media, so the public perception of tenants and tenants' rights and tenants' issues, and also politically. In the run-up to the last general election, there was a campaign by Shelter, so a tenants' rights organisation, that got 17,000 signatories focused in on rogue landlords. And I'm just going to take a slight sidebar there. I hate the term rogue landlords. Either they're criminals or they're not. I think calling them rogues does nobody any favours. Anyway, my slight rant over. Shelter got the ear of the Conservatives, then coalition partners, who were the Liberal Democrats, and got an amendment made to a piece of legislation. And that piece of legislation was the Deregulation Act. Now, the reason why it was an amendment and why that's important to you is because it was a piece of legislation. This had already been fully debated. It had been through both chambers of Parliament, and that meant that by the time the amendments came in, it wasn't properly debated. So, if you look at what the Deregulation Act was designed to effect, a reduced burden on business. It's how that could be summarised. It's not about landlords, it's not about tenants, it's not about your business, it's about reducing the burdens on business. That said, the amendment allowed changes to prevent retaliatory evictions and to change the Section 21 process to come through in time for the general election. And it basically, to me, is a political move that has an impact on your business. So, going through the key changes, the first is you cannot serve. So just show of hands, who manages properties in England? Wales, Scotland. That makes things easy. All of you, this affects then. So these changes only apply to properties in England. And it applies to every single tenancy in England that starts on or after the 1st of October of this year. So these changes are already in force. If you have tenants that are holding over and holding over and holding over, it has retrospective effect from the 1st of October 2018. So by 2018, every tenancy in England will be affected by these changes. So the first is, you cannot serve a Section 21 notice in the first 4 months of a tenancy. How many of you, show of hands again, serve a Section 21 notice at or near the start of a tenancy? Okay, you won't be able to do that for any tenancy that starts on or after the 1st of October. And the second change is Section 21 notices didn't used to have an expiration to them. Now it's basically use it or lose it. You have to issue proceedings within 6 months of serving a Section 21 notice. Now, I've got quite a lot of sympathy with those changes. First of all, if you serve a Section 21 notice at or near the start of a tenancy, it doesn't get the whole landlord-tenant relationship off to a great start. Here, welcome to your new home. By the way, you may be required to leave. I've got some sympathy with that. Secondly, holding a Section 21 notice over a tenant isn't particularly helpful. The likely outcome is they get the Section 21 notice, they shove it in a drawer, they forget about it, and several months or even several years down the line, their landlord, or you as the landlord's agent, say, do you remember we gave you that piece of paper? You've got a couple of months to get out. So I've got some sympathy with those changes. The second set of changes is that there is a new form of Section 21 notice. Now, you've got to use that new form of notice for every tenancy that started on or after the 1st of October. If you haven't seen it and you're an ALA member, I believe it's in the members area. It's also available from the Department of Communities and Local Government's website. So you have to use that new form for all new tenancies, and if you wish, you can use it for tenancies that started before that date. But the new form has a set of requirements that have to be met. Those requirements only apply to new tenancies. So I think if you used it for an old tenancy, i.e. one that started before the 1st of October, it may be confusing for your tenant. And the third, and now this is the most controversial part, for the very first time, your actions as the landlord's agents, or if they're managing the property themselves, the landlord's own actions, can affect the validity of a Section 21 notice. And this basically breaks down into 2 flavours. First of all, there are things that need to be done, and they are the tenant has to be given a valid EPC. Now that shouldn't be problematic, as you'll have the EPC from when you market the property. Just remember it is the whole EPC, not just the pretty graph. The second is the tenant must have a copy of the valid gas safety certificate. Again, you should have these if you're renting out the property. And the third, and I think this may throw people, is the tenant must have a copy of the Department of Communities and Local Government's How to Rent Guide. If you don't know what that is, it's on the DCLG website. You can print it off. You can serve it electronically if you've got the tenant's permission to serve it electronically. And all of this is about evidence, being able to show that you have given these documents to the tenant. In addition, the existing requirements, so if the property is required to be licensed, it has been licensed. And now just stop there, because requiring to be licensed, they could have made it narrow and said this refers to HMO licensing. To me, this hints at a wider national licensing scheme in the future. That's my speculation. It would be unusual to use that wording unless they were hinting at something wider. And the deposit, if a deposit's been taken, it has been properly protected. So there are things you have to do, and more importantly, I think you need to think about things defensively, things you need to be able to evidence. And now, on to retaliatory eviction. So, hands up, how many people here have heard of retaliatory eviction? Most of you. How many of you have come across a retaliatory eviction in practice? And if you're in direct sign of camera, you may not want to put your hand up. Okay. I've been talking about these changes around the UK. And my experience is, although people have heard of retaliatory eviction, they haven't come across it in practice. What it is a tenant serving a valid repair request and the landlord, in retaliation for that, choosing to serve a Section 21 notice. Now, although it's relatively narrowly defined like that, the impact is far greater on your business because there is now a prescribed way to deal with repairs. And if there's only one thing you do if you rent out properties or you're thinking of moving into lettings, is to take one of these guides. They're available on our stands. It's a how-to guide that we've put together with Arla. Oh, and I pressed the wrong button. There we go. To help you to get your head around the changes. They are complex and they are technical. So how does it work? Well, there are two scenarios. The first is the local authority serves a relevant notice, which is a Category 1 or Category 2 improvement notice, or an emergency remedial action notice. If they do that, irrespective of what has happened before, you cannot serve a Section 21 notice for 6 months. Problematic. The second is if the tenant has raised a complaint about the condition of their property, there is a whole workflow that sits behind it. So, tenant complains about the condition of their property. I've always thought about tenants' issues in terms of disrepair. This is broken, I'm a landlord, I have to fix it. And effectively, Section 11. This is a shift in thinking for the industry. It's about condition. So, let's say a tenant lives in a property that's too cold, so one of the recognised hazards under the Housing Health and Safety rating system. It's too cold, they have a boiler, it's working, it's just a rubbish boiler. Well, there's nothing broken, so you've got no issue about disrepair, but they have excess cold, and that would be a trigger under this, so it's about thinking about improvements that may be required to prevent lack of condition. There is then a 14-day period within which a landlord, or you guys, their managing agent, they have 14 days to serve what's called an adequate response. Unfortunately, the government hasn't defined what an adequate response is in the legislation. So, again, more test cases. But what it is a response in writing saying what you're going to do and a reasonable time frame for doing it. And in that, the word reasonable is key. It would be great if they gave some guidance. The only indication we've had is that a template response will not be sufficient in all circumstances. If, for example, there is an elderly tenant in winter, what would be a reasonable time frame for fixing that their broken boiler may be different to a young professional in the middle of summer. So a template response will not be satisfactory in all circumstances. Let's say you haven't given an adequate response because, for example, a member of your team picks up the phone, tells the tenant, Bob will be round on Tuesday and he'll fix it then. Well, it's not in writing. Or it's missed because you work in a busy office, or there's just an acknowledgement by email. Whatever happens, what is considered to be an adequate response is not provided. The tenant then complains to the local authority. Now, the tenant has to complain about substantially the same thing to the local authorities they've said to you. So they tell you it's too cold, they tell the local authority it's too cold. If the local authority investigates, they don't just check whether it's too cold. They have a full, I believe it's 29-point checklist of any potential hazards in the property they go through. If they find any one or more of those that are sufficiently serious to trigger a relevant notice, then you've got a problem. Any Section 21 notice you've served between the date of the tenant's repair request and the adequate and the relevant notice will be invalidated, and because you've got a relevant notice, no Section 21 can be served for another 6 months. Bad news all round. Now, you'd hope with local authorities being used to arbitrate whether or not something is sufficiently serious to prevent a landlord from getting their property back, there'll be some central government edict about what they should be doing and maybe even some extra funding for the new responsibilities. Well, as well as providing our software to letting agencies and block managers, we also supply a local authority, and my understanding is there is no central government guidance, there is no additional money, and what I think will happen is there will be delays. And just in case, and I hope no one here would be thinking about it, if you make it too hard for a tenant to complain in writing, a verbal complaint can be a valid trigger. If you can make it too hard for a tenant to complain verbally or in writing, they don't have to complain at all. They can just jump straight to the next stage in the process. Now, I can see by your smiling faces I've enthused you so far. So, more bad news. So, to me, Section 21, right notice, right time frame, right result. This list of exceptions should be good news, but to me it pushes it all further down a more adversarial and evidence-based process. So taking them in turn, the tenant does not use the property in a tenant-like manner. Let's say there's vermin in the property, rats. Are you going to be able to evidence that the rats are there because the tenant's left rubbish out, or because there's a latent defect with the structure? More work on you. Hopefully you'll be paid, but my experience as a landlord is you won't be. Disrepair due to a breach of a tenant's obligations. So let's say the window's smashed. Was the window smashed by the tenants, as you believed when they had a party, or by a passerby, as they're claiming? Again, it's all about evidence. When the Section 21 is served, the property is genuinely on the market for sale. Now, as you'd expect, the law has carved out the obvious sorts of things, like the landlord wanting to sell to a family member or a business associate. But all of this comes down to, what did the landlord intend to do when they served the Section 21? So if you have a client who wants to serve a Section 21 notice and is intending to sell, make sure you evidence it, and perhaps even use this as leverage to get them to speak to your colleagues in the sales team to start to document what they're doing and subtly nudge them down the process of instructing you. And from a purely selfish perspective, the one that terrifies me the most, a mortgagee seeking possession under a pre-existing mortgage. As a landlord, does that mean it's going to be harder for me to remortgage when a tenant's in place because my new mortgagee doesn't have the same protections? There are a huge number of grey areas, and again, this comes back to a rushed piece of legislation. Unfortunately, we're in the firing line. So what does this really mean? First of all, Section 21 proceedings are likely to become a lot trickier. Where you may have had a choice between using Section 8, so a more fraught process, and a Section 21 process, you may now choose to use a Section 8 process for non-payment of rent, antisocial behaviour, and the like. There is a risk of tenants gaming the system. So, this has been really widely publicised. It's got national press. It's unheard of for the lettings industry. That if tenants put together that if they complain to the local authority will go in with a checklist, they may see it as a fishing expedition of not having to move and not having to pay a higher rent. I think there will be delays because of the local authorities, as I've said. And show of hands, how many of you have heard of build to rent? Okay, I think in about 10 years' time, we'll look back at build to rent as one of the largest changes to the private rented sector. Build to rent is a shift from individual buy-to-let landlords to institutional investors. It's very much modelled on the American multifamily housing process, or sector even, and it's really supported by the government. So the government has put aside £3.5 billion of loans, and effectively it is a developer putting up a block of flats or a whole estate specifically for the purposes of renting them out, long-term rentals. And if you look at the wear and tear allowance changes, the changes to landlord's tax, so mortgage tax, I think this is a not so subtle shift from individuals to build-to-rent investors. Well, if the landlord of a block of flats rents out each individual unit and controls the common parts, then the lack of condition of those common parts can affect their ability to serve a Section 21, which is a lot of words to basically say, if you have a landlord who owns a block of flats and the tenant on the first floor has trip and slip hazards on the staircase on the way up, and they'd reasonably be expected to use that staircase, then if you're told about it, serve an adequate response within 14 days and get it fixed, because if you don't, you may not be able to serve a Section 21 notice for that flat. I think the impact on sales has been overlooked both in the trade press and in general commentary. The first thing is the sale of an investment property to an owner-occupier. So, the vendor, possibly your client, will have the covenant that they will sell with vacant possession. Now, if that vacant possession is predicated on a successful Section 21 process, you can reasonably expect their risk-averse solicitors to be asking, can you provide us with copies of every repair request and every adequate response back so we can advise our client to sign? The risk shifts if there's a sale from one investor to another investor. So the person purchasing, if they intend to relet, to redevelop, or do anything that requires a Section 21 notice to be validly served, their solicitor will be asking those questions. At the moment, there is no standard form of inquiries from the Law Society. They're looking at it. And in the meantime, I suspect this means delayed transaction. So just something for you to think about. But also, now that you know about it, when someone comes through your door and they are an investor and they're looking to sell, or someone who's looking for property, you've got some inside knowledge on something that's been largely overlooked. So why should you care? Lettings is still a very localised business. I use letting agents near some of my properties, and landlords know landlords. So let's take the worst possible scenario. Your administrative error stops a landlord serving a Section 21 notice for 6 months. Chances are you'll lose them as a client. Chances are they'll tell other people. But the real opportunity around this is that the changes don't just apply to you. They apply to landlords who manage their own properties. So as I see it, the cost benefit for most landlords of having a professionally managed service has just shifted. If you tell your let-only clients about these changes, you're in a great position as long as you've got the right processes in place. And one thing to keep in mind throughout this is there are a huge number of uncertainties. There are lots of grey areas. So please keep up to date with all of the developments. We're looking at the first, because you can't serve a Section 21 for 4 months, and a couple of months for the notice, it will be about April of next year that we start to see the first cases coming through the courts. I wouldn't be surprised to see some tenants' charities sponsoring tenants through to see quite where the lines lie. And if I'm right, I'm about to tell you a little bit about FixFlo. No, I'm not. I couldn't quite remember where it was. So the law relates to process, not outcome. If you've served the right notice and you've got the evidence, then your Section 21 won't be retrospectively invalidated. The form of adequate response is not prescribed, and just keep remembering, it's not the government knocking on your door, trading standards looking at your notice board. It is a tenant who doesn't want to move out. And hopefully this time it will be a bit about FixFlo. No. Well played. So our top 3 tips for getting your business ready. The first is keep meticulous records. Every single repair request and every response you get back so that you can evidence you've acted correctly. The second is inspect your property frequently and keep written records. So this is to deal with the exceptions. If, for example, you have inspections every 2 or 3 months during a tenancy and there are no rats, no rats, no rats, lots of rats, it will make it easier for you to prove that it's, or lead the court to believe that the rats are there because of the tenant's actions rather than a latent defect. And finally, tell your landlord base about the changes. So the guide on our desk, together with timelines we put together with Arla on the changes, are available for free download from our website. You can use that in your brief your market e-shots out to prospective landlords, to your let-only landlords, and I hope I get a commission. And final time, yes.
Welcome to the award-winning FixFlo platform, a simple solution to help streamline your repairs process. With inbuilt advice, tenants' problems can be resolved without having to come to you. If tenants need further assistance, they're guided to give you the precise information you need to deal with the problem quickly and efficiently, and can even easily add photos to help you understand the problem without having to inspect the property. You'll be given their full address and current contact details, other useful information, and a fully customizable message reminds them about call-out charges before they submit. You'll then receive a clear and concise report in English directly to your inbox, so you can work out a repair strategy without any chasing calls or emails for details when your tenants are at work. The platform is available in more than 14 different languages. It can be customized to match your brand, and tenants can access it straight from your website using any device. FixFlo really does save you time, improve productivity, and build better relationships with your tenants. Don't wait. Start your free trial now at www.fixflo.com.
So we provide repairs software to about 1,200 letting agency offices across the UK, and our clients span from Sydney in Australia through to Florida in the US. One of the changes we've recently made is in respect to the legislative changes I've just described. So every repair request that comes through FixFlo is time and date stamped. Now, the government hasn't said what an adequate response is, but we, together with Arla, have put together what we consider it to be, and Arla's view is, while you need to take your own legal advice and no liability is accepted, due to uncertainties surrounding the legislation. In the absence of further government guidance, Arla considers that the FixFlo system for dealing with the need to provide an adequate response constitutes best practice for the industry. So every repair request that comes in is time and date stamped. You get what Arla considers is best practice back to the tenant, and you can update it. So if, for example, there is an elderly tenant, you can send that back, and everything is compiled into one report, which you can annex to your Section 21 notice. And best of all, due to our recent integration with expert agents, it saves you even more time. So tenant report to repair through the website, that information directly comes into your expert agent system, matches against the right property, and creates a draft works order. So that means your tenants can report repairs in over 40 languages, and they come through in English. Your tenants don't get in touch with what they're responsible for or things that they can fix themselves. Brilliant. And you don't even have to type anything in because it goes straight into expert agent. Are there any questions? Do I have time for questions? Absolutely. So writing includes electronic communication. So just think about it practically. You've got a member of your team who receives a text message for a tenant. Well, that would be enough to trigger the requirements. If you have multiple offices, a tenant writing a handwritten note and putting it through one of your doors, will it get to the right person? You've got 14 days to respond. By funneling all of your tenants through the single portal where you know exactly what's happened and when, and you know the response that's gone back, and everything is compiled for you, your business is better protected. Thanks for the question. You can't force them to use FixFlo. You can. They could do. They absolutely could do if they were malicious. What you would hope, though, is that by educating tenants who come on, saying this is the way we expect it to happen, it's about changing human nature. So we get about 25,000 repairs to our system every month in the UK. It's pretty widely used. And for existing tenants, it's about education. For new tenants, it's about telling them this is how it happens. But you cannot physically force someone to do it that way. You stand a better chance if you've got something rather than... I know that some people have put you have to report your repairs through FixFlo in their tenancy agreements. I'm not sure whether that would be valid, but some people have done that. In order to be protected by the legislation, so ignoring the situation where the local authority just investigates by themselves, which is basically out of your control, although I would expect them to notify you first. In order to be protected, the tenant would put their request in writing, unless you've made it too difficult for them to put it in writing, in which case they can do it verbally, or you've made it too difficult for them to get in touch at all, in which case they don't have to complain at all. Mm-hmm. And you can be exactly sure of what they've complained about, because their complaint to you has to be substantially the same as to the local authority. So if they complain to you about X and to the local authority about Y, they've not followed the prescribed process. We survey tenants who use our system, and it's about education, as I keep saying. Once they use it, it's fine. Over 3/4 say it's better than reporting a repair by telephone or by email. It's available around the clock. It's convenient. I think slightly sadly for our society, particularly the younger generation, are becoming increasingly bad at human contact. They would rather do everything from their smartphone. Why speak to someone when I can press a few buttons? So it very much plays to them, and that will be the changing demographic of your client or your tenant base. It's based on the number of properties you have under management. The prices start at £40 plus VAT per month for up to 150 managed properties, no long-term contract, and that includes the cost of integration into expert agents. I think that's it. Well, thank you very much.